Only after the war did we learn that on the evening of 6 June, officers at the headquarters of the German 7th Army, located in a chateau in Le Mans, were studying a map of France in an attempt to discover our future intentions. The tranquil course of the long German occupation of France was interrupted at 1:30 a.m. On 6 June, when the German 84th Corps briefly reported the landing of Allied airborne troops in the area from Caen to Cotentin inclusive. News of the Allied landings on the Cotentin Peninsula immediately alarmed the German 7th Army, which feared that the Allies would attempt to isolate the port of Cherbourg by cutting off the Cotentin Peninsula. However, the German High Command considered such a conclusion hasty. Both Rommel's Army Group headquarters and the Western High Command, which was headed by von Rundstedt, weighed the first reports of the landing cautiously, hesitant to believe too obvious signs. Most officers in both these headquarters assumed that the Allies would invade France through the Strait of Pas de Calais. They were so sure of this that there was no way they could accept that the Allies would strike the main blow through Normandy. From the outset, they had decided that the Normandy landing was intended to divert the 15th Army's attention away from Pas de Calais. The enemy took pride in revealing our intentions, not realizing that he had been misled by the false plan with which we had skillfully covered up the plan for Operation Overlord. Thus, treating the landing at Cotentin as a Yankee trick, the enemy fell into the trap set by us in the Pas de Calais. For the next 6 weeks, while the German 7th Army suffered defeats in the Battle of France due to lack of reserves, strategists in Berlin continued to adhere to their erroneous point of view, leading to fatal consequences. Only after the German defences had been breached did they realize how badly mistaken they had been in their assumption of an Allied landing in the Pas de Calais area. By this time, however, the 7th Army had been defeated and all of France was open right up to the German border. Germany's defeat in France was explained to some extent by the exhaustion of its forces and Hitler's blunders. However, the German General Staff also bore a share of the responsibility for the defeat. It was the German generals who were the most malleable and fell for the bait, believing the Allied landings in the Pas de Calais area. As the first day of the invasion drew towards evening, the German 7th Army's confidence that Cherbourg was not our main objective was shaken. At 6:45 a.m., that is, 15 minutes after the start of the operation, Army HQ reported to Rommel's command post that Allied shipboard artillery fire on the Omaha site might be part of an elaborate Allied plan to divert German attention away from the main force's landing site elsewhere. Shortly before noon, Army HQ decided that the main blow would be struck in the English landing zone. By this time, the headquarters of the German corps reported on the rapid overcoming of the English coastal barriers and moving in the direction of flat terrain, convenient for the action of tanks, which begins behind the Caen and extends to the Seine. The 7th Army's assumption that the British landing posed the main threat was reinforced by a report received from the Corps of the failure of the Allied invasion in the entire area from the River Wye to Bayeux. This area precisely encompassed the Omaha section. The German 352nd Division was so confident of the defeat of Jarrow's troops that at 13 hours, 35 men reported to Corps headquarters that American troops had been dropped into the English Channel. By late afternoon, 7th Army transmitted a more cautious assessment of the situation to Army Group headquarters. The Army's fears of an offensive on Cherbourg had not yet been confirmed, as even by 16:20 mine. In the Army headquarters was not yet aware of the landing of Collins on the site Utah. Our airborne landing had greatly upset the enemy's lines of communication. Army headquarters therefore concluded that fears about Cherbourg were unfounded. Airborne landing on Cotentin. The Germans considered as a diversion to draw German troops from the area of Caen, where the British were on the offensive. A few minutes later, however, Army HQ hastily repudiated its prediction. Reports were received that the airborne troops at Cotentin had been reinforced by large reinforcements from the sea. By 6 p.m., the badly battered 352nd Division had amended its greatly exaggerated report of Allied difficulty in the Omaha section. Not only had the Americans gained a foothold on the coast, but, by seeping between the strongholds on the coast, they were making their way inland. Meanwhile, Rundstedt demanded from the 7th Army to eliminate the Allied bridgehead by evening. And from Berlin came an order from Colonel General Alfred Jodl to throw all available reserves in the battle. However, by cash forces, he meant only the troops stationed in northwestern France, and not the 15th Army, which was on the coast of Pas de Calais, where it was monitoring the strait, waiting for the appearance of the new Allied fleet. In the evening, the German 7th Army made a new assessment of the situation. On the Cotentin Peninsula, German forces seemed strong enough to stiffen the Allied landing force, for on a hunch Hitler had ordered as early as May to reinforce this strategic sector with 2 divisions, bringing the total number of troops to 4 divisions, along the Normandy coast from the mouth of the River Wye to Bayeux. The 7th Army had not yet ascertained the true extent of our landing at Omaha. Therefore, the enemy decided that the main blow the Allies strike in the area of Caen, where the British tanks were advancing. The Germans sent their tanks here and fell into the net we set up. While the British distracted the enemy and misled him as to our true intentions, we sought to unite the American landing sites and occupy the port of Cherbourg. But when Collins began to advance towards the west coast, seeking to cut off the Cotentin Peninsula, the enemy again began to regard Cherbourg as a likely initial Allied objective. On the 3rd day after the invasion, the enemy's growing suspicions were confirmed when a copy of the 7th Corps battle order was found in the Straits by the Germans. What the enemy had at first thought to be a finely calculated diversion, he now regarded as a second major strike. To repel this blow, the enemy moved to Cotentin reserves from the Brittany Peninsula to prevent us from capturing the port of Cherbourg at any cost. The Germans realized as well as we did that we were in dire need of reinforcements. We clearly realized that if the enemy succeeded in strengthening the defense around Cherbourg, it might delay our capture of the port for several weeks. On 9 June, therefore, I ordered Collins to break through the peninsula to the west coast and cut it off, and only then to advance northward on Cherbourg. The bridgehead established by the 82nd Division west of the Murderet River had already narrowed the width of the corridor to the Cotentin Peninsula by 1/3. However, the operation to cut off Cotentin could not be launched without a firm foothold on the coast by combining the Omaha and Utah sections into one common bridgehead and capturing Carentan. On the evening of 11 June, Kirk's adjutant came ashore with a gallon of ice cream. The adjutant reported that Admiral King and General Arnold would be arriving the next day. Later that evening, we were informed that General Marshall would be arriving with them. Eisenhower would accompany General Marshall from England. I asked Montgomery's permission not to attend the meeting scheduled for 10 a.m. the next day, and for the first time since the landing got a clean change of underwear. The group arrived at the Easy Red site early in the morning. This meeting with General Marshall was the 3rd of 4 brief encounters I had with him throughout the war. He hopped off the amphibious truck onto the beach, glanced around the coast, then looked out into the strait where the huge armada was bobbing at anchor. Within a week, the Omaha site had been cleared of property abandoned and left behind on the first day of the invasion, and was now one of Europe's major ports. Barbed Wazires cleared the coast of obstacles. Barbed wire wrecked lorries and other property, dumping it all into a huge anti-tank ditch dug far enough away from the maximum tide line. Unloading points were flagged, and military policemen regulated the movement of the convoys, directing them to exits from the coast. Despite all this, with each high tide, new loads of abandoned and sunken property were thrown ashore and piled up in disarray on the coast. As General Marshall's amphibious truck came ashore, a broken tennis racket, half hidden in the wet sand, caught his eye. Nearby, in a deep rut left by a tank track, lay a boxing glove swollen from the water. At some distance from the shore we had sunk the Liberty and obsolete warships, which formed a breakwater that made it possible to unload at Omaha by lighters. Gooseberry, as the breakwater was called, was the forerunner of a large artificial harbour designed and manufactured in England. Inside the wave-protected space, self-propelled ferries, loaded to the brim with vehicles and guns, drifted peacefully between the open bows of the tank landing craft and the shore, on which sappers had laid steel mats to create hard platforms for unloading. The heights from which enemy fire had pinned Huebner's soldiers to the ground on the day of the landing were now riddled with trenches. Here the fleet shore parties and the sappers who serviced the coast had buried themselves in sand from shrapnel from anti-aircraft shells and enemy bombs during night air raids. More resourceful soldiers covered their shelters with various debris picked up on the shore, maneuvering in a dense network of barrage balloons, C-47 Air. Ambulances landed on the sites, evacuating the wounded to England. In a fortnight, more than 15,000 wounded were evacuated from the Omaha site, and on the high ground in the passageway, leading from the Easy Red section, lay American soldiers, covered with white blankets awaiting burial, in a cemetery set up on high ground off the coast. In the morning, the 101st Division occupied Carentan, but the town had not yet been completely cleared of the enemy, who continued to shell the important road between the Omaha and Utah sections. Having rounded the Omaha section by car, we were about to transfer to a torpedo boat to reach the Utah section. Hansen had reconnoitered the route early in the morning, but the traffic on the congested roads was so heavy that we would have needed too many military policemen stationed along the road to order it. A traffic jam anywhere on the road could have delayed the arrival of the transports at the water's edge and slowed the unloading of the ships. I was convinced that General Marshall would rather set out on foot himself than allow at least one truckload of ammunition not to be delivered. I foresaw that General Marshall might take a critical view of columns of motor cars marching without intervals, and thought it best to explain this breach of regulations to him without delay. At first, we tried to bring order to the movement of vehicles by requiring drivers to maintain a set distance of 20 meters between trucks. Drivers simply ignored this order and followed each other without any interval. Soldiers are practical, I explained to Marshall. If they'd ever been shelled or bombed from the air, they'd never huddle together. But if I were to berate the drivers for not keeping their distance, they would probably look at me and think, "Doesn't that idiot know that German air power is kaput?" Our stringer of reconnaissance vehicles moved between columns of lorries raising clouds of choking white dust on the Normandy roads. The dust clogged our throats, made our eyes water, and whitened King's neat blue uniform. From the Omaha station we turned in the direction of Isigny, past the dried-up, stinking reservoir at Grand Camp-Lee's Bains, formed by the tide, where the enemy had destroyed a dozen fishing boats and damaged the dam gates. From the sea came the rumble of a salvo as the battleship Texas began shelling the plain behind Carentan, where the enemy had retreated from the town. After my insistence on the allocation of large warships to shell the coast, I was anxious to show Admiral King the results of the fleet's large-caliber artillery fire in the streets of Isigny. Hansen positioned 2 armoured cars in the village square to cover our group with the fire of their guns. Generals Marshall, King, Arndt, and Eisenhower followed in open vehicles, and one German sniper could immortalize his name as a German hero. We had breakfast in the mess tent at the 1st Army Command Post, contenting ourselves with rations, tea, and biscuits. After I outlined our plans to capture Cherbourg, General Marshall briefly introduced us to global warfare. He later mentioned that Fleet Command had asked him to put me in command of the invasion force in the Pacific. I must have had a surprised look on my face because Marshall immediately added that he had turned down the Navy, informing them that I would be used for another job. He was referring, of course, to the command of a group of armies, which I was assuming immediately after breaking through the enemy's defenses. Having visited the site Utah and talked with Collins, Marshall, King, Arnold and Eisenhower on the same day returned to the Minesweeper and departed back to England. When Hitler, who was in Salzburg, learned of the Allied invasion on 6 June, he is said to have rejoiced. Hitler was convinced that before the end of the week, Rommel would still be able to properly punish us by sinking us in the English Channel. However, on the evening of 12 June, we celebrated our first week ashore and were not subjected to a single serious counterattack in the American landing zone. So far, only the British had suffered from German tanks while advancing towards Cayenne and while attempting to link up with Hubner at Common. Meanwhile, reinforcements were arriving for the Germans from elsewhere in France, and they reinforced their positions, especially around the key communications hubs of Cayenne and Saint-Lô. However, even after a week of feverish efforts to move reinforcements, Rommel still lacked the strength to organize an offensive towards the coast. Meanwhile, during the first week on the coast, we have already managed to double our forces. By the evening of 12 June in France, landed 16 Allied divisions, of which 7 divisions were British and 9 American. The British and we landed about the same number of tank units, a total of about 3 armoured divisions. After we broke through the reinforced concrete fortifications Rommel on the coast on the first day of the invasion, he became in dire need of reserves to stop our advance. Infantry was in short supply, and 3 armoured divisions, moved by Rommel to Cayenne, took up defences there in a last-minute attempt to save the town. As a result, when Monty's pressure on Cayenne intensified, Rommel could not withdraw some of the tanks to organise a counterattack without exposing himself to the risk that the British would break through his front in this sector. The tank is a very effective tool in the offensive. In defence, tanks are only effective when used as a reserve position behind a defensive line to counterattack against enemy infantry or tanks that have broken through. Using tanks in defence instead of infantry to hold a defensive line is both impractical and uneconomical. From the moment of our landing, Rommel was severely constrained by the lack of infantry and artillery. Moreover, every enemy unit arriving at the front in Normandy bore the marks of Allied airstrikes during the perilous journey across France. Our aviation did damage to the approaching reserves, but it could not stop or destroy them. Every evening when our fighters returned to the aerodromes after the summer sun had set, the enemy, under cover of darkness, resumed the movement of troops along the roads. This was difficult and dangerous, but the Germans showed amazing ingenuity in moving their troops to the front. In spite of the enemy's lack of reserves, I did not discount the possibility of a powerful German counter-offensive and therefore became increasingly anxious about two vulnerable places in our front line. Both of these were at the junctions of our sectors, and the junctions were so weak as to tempt the enemy to strike at them. The first such junction was on the dividing line between the American and British landing zones. The second junction was through Carentan, where the Omaha and Utah areas converged. The junction of two Allied armies is always a weak point that the enemy can easily exploit. The weakness lies in the difficulties that may arise in organizing the interaction of the two armies during the defense of this sector. In the sector which we had been clipped from the Dempsey bridgehead, this weakness was particularly conspicuous. Hubner's 1st Division rushed boldly across hedgerow-blocked fields to Coman, advanced 32 kilometers south of the coast and entrenched itself there. This division cut deeper into the enemy defences than any other Allied division. In contrast to Hubner's division, the British, operating on its left, advanced in half as much, not covered for a large part of its left flank, and thus put it under the attack of German troops concentrated at Caen. Dempsey attempted to advance to equalize the front, but was stopped by German tanks. The British withdrew to the original line, and Hubner now had to worry about securing his unreliable wedge himself. To cover an exposed flank of 13 kilometers, he put up a small barrier. When the enemy threatened this flank, I immediately sent tanks of the 2nd Armoured Division to Hubner's disposal, creating a reserve of them. In the meantime, the enemy had withdrawn a little further behind Carentan and halted 10 kilometers away. Here the enemy entrenched, knowing that if he succeeded in repelling the town, he would cut the American bridgehead in half and would not allow our troops to move freely between the landing sites. On the evening of 12 June, Dixon burst into my tent with the news that a German offensive on Carentan was expected the next day. The offensive was to be led by the 17th Essex Grenadier Motorized Division. Although Max Taylor had reinforced his position after occupying the town, the 101st Airborne Division did not have the necessary heavy weapons to repel the tank attack. I ordered Jarrow by telephone to send Maurice Rose with combat command from the 2nd Armoured Division to Carentan. Jarrow groaned when he heard my order. Without tanks, he could be in a tight spot if the enemy struck from Hubner's flank. The attack at Carentan might just be a diversion to weaken our flank here, Jarrow said. Maybe, I agreed, but we can't let Taylor's house burn down just because Hubner is afraid his house might catch fire. Fortunately, the enemy was not as cunning as Jarrow thought. On the morning of 13 June, the Germans hit Carentan, coming within 500 meters of the town before Taylor's paratroopers managed to repel the enemy with small arms fire at 10 HRs. 30 men. Rose's tanks arrived in the town. With their help, the 101st Division counterattacked the 17th Essex Division and drove it back to a plain strewn with the corpses of German soldiers. The next evening I summoned Jarrow to my command post. He readily arrived, hoping to regain Rose and his battle command, as Hubner's exposed flank was still troubling him. When he entered, there was no way I could handle a map too large for my tent. I shall be very glad, I said to him, when Joe Collins takes Cherbourg. Then we can cut off that ledge with the Cotentin Peninsula from the map, and it will fit in the tent. I'll be glad too, agreed Jarrow. As soon as Collins takes Cherbourg, I won't have to worry about the lack of supplies coming into my station. She pushed his chair to the map and pointed to the loop formed in his front line in the neighbourhood of the English sector. To the left of Hubner's flank, on the enemy side, were circled in red pencil 2 rectangles. Above each were 2 X's A. These were divisions, and the ovals inside the rectangle indicated that these divisions were tank divisions. Brad, I'm very concerned. Jarrow began. Look at the map, you'll see that my position is not brilliant. Until the British move into line with us, my left flank will be under constant threat. The Boches could break through Hubner's rear and cut off our troops at Coman, and my defences are not sufficiently echeloned in depth to stop the enemy. I understand your position, G. It worries me as much as it does you. We took a great risk in taking the tanks off your flank. However, Rose is now in Carantana and will remain there at least overnight. We repelled the enemy's tanks, and if they had broken through, it would have been devilishly difficult for us to hold at Carantan. If the Germans cut the road and isolated Collins, we would lose our freedom of manoeuvre. Jarrow nodded in agreement. Let's do it this way, G. I'll order Rose to march back tomorrow, but on one condition, that I don't receive any disturbing reports from Dixon regarding Caranthon. I'd hate to have to rush Rose's combat command again. No sooner had I given the order than I immediately cancelled it. The defeated Ost Division had become active again in the Carantan area. Meanwhile, Monty threw to the aid of Gero part of the 7th British Armoured Division. The British tanks concentrated on Hubner's exposed flank, and thus the Germans missed their last great opportunity to exploit our weakness at this junction. It was only a week after the landing, and we had already begun to look towards St. Lo, standing on a rocky eminence overlooking the valley of the River Wyre. In ancient times, this town, halfway between our invasion site and the west coast of the Cotentin, was Charlemagne's citadel. The town's tall, bomb-damaged church stands at the crossroads of roads of importance to Rommel. The town itself is located on the shortest road from Bayeux in the Calvados department to Counties on the west coast. This road sort of cut off the Norman Bulge from the rest of France, occupying Saint-Lô and advancing to Coutances. We would not only cut Cherbourg from the main forces of Rommel, but also largely reduced the Allied front line and thus facilitated the concentration of American troops to organize a breakthrough of the German defense. The enemy understood, as well as we did, the strategic importance of Saint-Lô, located on high ground, and concentrated here a significant part of its meagre infantry reserves. As a result, when the 29th Division was already 5 kilometers from the town, enemy resistance increased and Gerhardt had to suffer greater losses than we could afford. Our primary objective was Cherbourg, and I was not at all willing to restrain our forces at Saint-Lô until we had captured Cherbourg. As a matter of fact, I said to Herson about Saint-Lô, even if we took the town, we would have little chance of advancing west of it. The Germans are perfectly fortified, creating a deep defence. It's better to take the high ground east and west of Saint-Lô first. If we manage to take them and start shelling the roads, I'll bet that Saint-Lô will be ours. Then there will be no point in the Germans clinging to it. But Gerhard would like to advance and take the town, Thorson said. Hey, if Gerhard could take Saint-Lô without breaking the back of the 29th Division, I would not object. I highly doubt, however, that he will succeed in doing so. Certainly, the occupation of Saint-Lô would be a sensation and would give material for correspondence. But we cannot sacrifice a division for that. We can do perfectly well without Saint-Lô for the time being. On 15 June, Corlet's 19th Corps arrived at the front, replacing Gero's troops at Saint-Lô and taking over a section of the front near Carantana. Like Gero, Corlet wanted to break into Saint. Concern for the preservation of American troops, I restrained Corlet's ambition and ordered him to entrench himself on his line. Thorson laughed at my struggle with Corlet. They have prepared for a bear hunt, he remarked. Both Corlet and Gerhardt are eager to take Saint-Lô. They'll stay on their lines, I grumbled, even if it meant taking away all their ammunition. No one will move until Joe takes Cherbourg. I want Pett and G firmly entrenched in their lines. The enemy can still strike, and we will not risk the enemy breaking through to the Omaha section. I cancelled my prohibition to advance on Saint-Lô only a few days before the breakthrough. By that time, we needed the roads through that town to develop the offensive. On 9 June, I ordered Collins to cut the Cotin Peninsula at its base before the offensive on Cherbourg. The 82nd and 9th Divisions were to carry out this task, while the 4th and 90th Divisions were to advance on Cherbourg. While the 9th Division was unloading ashore, the 90th Division was assigned the task of extending the 82nd Division's bridgehead west of the Murderette River. Our choice of the 90th Division proved unsuccessful. For 3 days, the division was in a hurry to go on the offensive. On the 4th day, Collins asked me to replace the division commander. The division arrived in England in April 1944 under the command of Brigadier General J. McKelvey, formerly the artillery commander of the same division. Shortly before leaving the United States, the old commander of the 90th Division had been promoted to corps commander. Thus, McKelvey had to take on a job for which he was not adequately prepared. Nevertheless, McKelvey's work during his 2 months in England convinced me that it was possible to try to entrust him with the command of the division. Unfortunately, he inherited many incapable commanders, and as a result the 90th Division was disgraced at the very beginning of the offensive. Across the base of the Cotentin Peninsula stretched fields crisscrossed by hedgerows, which were a natural line of obstacles far more powerful than Rommel could create. Over the centuries, the broad, fat plains were gradually divided into smaller and smaller areas of pasture, enclosed by earthen walls that eventually became ramparts. Often these walls reached the height and width of a tank and were crowned by dense thickets of trees and thorn bushes. The roots of the trees strengthened the walls compacted by time, as a steel frame strengthens concrete, turning it into reinforced concrete. Along many of the earthen walls run deep drainage ditches that the enemy used as ready-made communication passages. To advance from pasture to pasture required making passages in these walls under heavy fire from a well-camouflaged enemy. Not even in Tunisia had we encountered such suitable terrain for defence. Collins believed that such terrain presented no less difficulty than the jungles of Guadalcanal. Most of the untried divisions in the first battles comes to confusion as a result of a strong nervous tension of people. Until the soldiers become accustomed to the agony of the wounded and cease to be afraid to look death in the eye, they instinctively huddle together out of fear and confusion. They cannot be thrown into the attack alone, but must be led by the commander himself, sometimes even resorting to persuasion. After a few days, this condition usually passes. The division receives a baptism of fire, and the troops respond normally to the confident and reasonable actions of the commanding officer. If possible, we tried to mitigate the force of the psychological impact of the battle by sending each new unit to a quiet section of the front before using it in the offensive. But when the 90th Division unloaded on the Utah section following the 4th Division, there were sections of the front. We had no choice, and we threw the division into the offensive under conditions in which even veterans could experience great hardship. However, such an unexpected test fell not only to the 90th Division, and other inexperienced divisions put into battle sometimes even more difficult conditions, but most of them with honour withstood these tests. But almost from the moment it went on the offensive, the 90th Division became a difficult division. The division's action so irritated the command that the 1st Army headquarters dropped its arms and demanded that it be disbanded and used as replenishments to man other divisions. We retained the division, however, and it subsequently became one of the best divisions in the European theatre. From this example, we can see how quickly a strong-willed commander can inspire his subordinate troops. Moreover, this example once more confirmed what we have long insisted, namely that, from the point of view of personnel, all divisions are the same, they differ only in the skill and ability of their commanders. When Collins appointed his deputy Landrum to replace McKelvey as commander of the 90th Division, we warned Jan to clean up the division's command staff thoroughly. Landrum, a veteran of the Kiska expedition, had come to Collins' command in England at the latter's request. Delighted at the opportunity of obtaining the division, Landrum recklessly promised me the delivery of a cocktail of sea water from the west coast of Cotentin. However, 3 more weeks of unremarkable engagement passed, and the division again disgraced itself. 2 companies surrendered to the enemy, and the Germans captured the defensive positions of an entire battalion. Landrum had cleaned up the division, but not enough. The division's morale was shattered, and its confidence was gone. Landrum failed to spark the division and had to withdraw. Although my headquarters continued to insist that the division be disbanded and used as resupplies to man other divisions, I had reason to hope that a strong commander could save the division. On 30 July, we found such a commander in the person of Brigadier General Raymond McLean, who had earned his rank in the National Guard. I had discovered McLean during the Sicily campaign, where he was the artillery commander of Middleton's division. From there, I transferred him to England, where he was at my disposal in case of contingencies such as occurred. In Sicily, McLean proved himself to be a commander who did not like to be at the command post. He spent all his time with the soldiers at the front, cultivating among them the offensive spirit that so characterized the 45th Division. Despite my belief in McLean's ability to make a fundamental difference in the 90th Division, I felt obliged to warn him that the division had already changed 2 commanders in 1 month. We deliberately put him in that position. "We want to make the division combat ready," I told him, "even if that requires changing all the senior officers. I firmly believe that the division only needs a good shake-up from top to bottom of the command staff. Will you help me get rid of the undesirable officers and give me replacements?" McLean asked. "Anything, Ray. Go to the division for 2 days and study the situation on the ground. Then come back to me with a list and we'll get rid of any officers you don't want." McLean came back exactly 2 days later with a list of 16 line officers. I gave the list to Ginger O'Hare and ordered them all to be detached from the division and in return give McLean any he wanted. When McLean left the division in October 1944, taking over the corps, his successor inherited one of the best fighting divisions on the Allied front. With the arrival of Eddie's 9th Division, Collins drove the hapless 90th Division to the rear, and Eddie and 82nd Division veterans launched an offensive to cut off Cotentin and isolate Cherbourg. Eddie's division rushed towards the west coast, with Ridgway covering it from the south, beyond the Dovey River frontier. In the middle of the peninsula, where the river turns north, the lightly armed 82nd Division halted, and Eddie, dividing the division into 2 columns, dashed boldly towards the sea. 8 weeks later, Manton Eddy became corps commander. He received his appointment a week after the breakthrough and for the first day in command of the corps, past 115 kilometers. The next time he met me, he grinned. "Bloody hell. Brad, your boys kept me going for a long time. I'd rather be in command of a corps. I was wasting my time as a division commander. As Eddie's division approached the last rocket road across the Cotentin Peninsula, it became clear that unless the enemy could stop its advance and prevent it from reaching the west coast, the crucial port of Cherbourg would be ours. Reinforcements could have helped the enemy to delay the fall of Cherbourg, but there were no reinforcements. The enemy lacked the strength to hold us back along the entire front line. The enemy did not dare to withdraw from the English section in front of Cayenne, fearing that Monty's tanks could break through in the direction of Paris. Equally, the Germans could not risk and at Saint-Lô. If the Americans broke through the front of the Germans in this area, the enemy troops on the Cotentin would be trapped, and then dissipate all their hopes to shackle and then destroy our troops in the bridgehead. Anticipating Eddie's advance across the Cotentin, the Germans decided to divide their forces on the peninsula. 2 divisions withdrew to Cherbourg to strengthen the defences of the port, and 2 turned south and created a defensive line on the isthmus of the Cotentin Peninsula. 2 days after Eddie's throw on 14 June, Monk Dixon came to lunch in the mess tent, whistling a song. They called me an old grouch. He smiled and craned his long neck. "I have good news for today. The Boche are pulling back. They are ceding the peninsula to us." The next day, on Hitler's orders, the German troops in front of Eddie's front divided. One part withdrew to the north, the other to the south. On the evening of 17 June, Collins reported by telephone that the peninsula was cut. Thus, just 11 days after the landing, we had connected the bridgeheads and cut off Cherbourg. There were only 9 days left to take Cherbourg within the stipulated time, that is, 20 days after the invasion. The next day, the first press conference after the landing was held at 1st Army headquarters. O'Hare had compiled a list of American losses up to and including 15 June, and I wanted the United States to know about them. Our losses in the 10 days after the landing totaled 15,000 men, but they were much lower than expected. We hoped that the immediate release to the press of the casualty figures would reassure the American people, to whom so many different exaggerated estimates had been reported prior to the invasion. The supreme headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force, however, inquired of Monty as to the advisability of releasing these figures to the press. Monty resisted and reprimanded me, arguing with obvious irritation that such information was premature, because it would help the enemy determine our troops' strength. The enemy, I reassured Monty, would simply not believe our figures because they were far below those reported by the Germans. Besides, we would not put anything in the press that the enemy did not know. Berlin radio did me a great favour by intercepting our message broadcast by the BBC. It called our data a monstrous lie, concocted to conceal from the American people the extent of the disaster that had befallen us on the coast. This altercation was the only time Monty challenged the decision I had already made. Thereafter, neither of us ever brought up the fact again. During the war in Europe, I often had far from warm feelings for Monty, but this never affected our personal and official relations. We were so careful to conceal our annoyance at Monty's actions that I doubt if he was aware of it. If there really was as strong an antagonism between us as some gossipers would have us believe, Eisenhower might justifiably have had us both thrown out. Quite often during the war, I challenged Monty's considerations, criticized his decisions, doubted the reasonableness of his measures. Unlike Monty's British subordinates, I was not so intimidated by the legend of Montgomery that I did not hesitate to accept his decisions as infallible. Bronte, like all of us, was mortal, and since he was mortal, he made mistakes. For the attack on Cherbourg, Collins outlined 3 directions north of the site of Eddy's breakthrough. 1 division was advancing in each direction. On the right, in a heavily fortified strip, operated Barton's 4th Division. In the centre, the newly landed 79th Division, and on the left, Manton Eddy's 9th Division. The offensive was scheduled to begin at 3 a.m. on 19 June. The 4th and 79th Divisions had little difficulty in meeting this deadline, as they had already reached their original lines. Eddy's 9th Division, however, had to change the direction of its offensive abruptly. Manton did not reach the last intended line on the west coast of Cotentin until 5 a.m. For 22 hours he had to turn the troops, numbering 20,000 people from the western direction to the north towards Cherbourg, evacuate the sick and wounded, lay lines of communication, scout the terrain, outline the boundary lines, give orders, transfer warehouses of ammunition and other supplies, and then launch a new offensive on a front of 14.5 kilometers. Eddy did not blink an eye, however, and when the time came for the offensive, his division rushed forward. Eddy was entitled to a respite, for his soldiers were tired after the rapid advance, but to give the enemy no chance to recover, we had to advance with the utmost speed. If the Germans had been given even 1 day to prepare their positions, further advance would have cost us much more. As a result of the rapid change in the front of the offensive, Eddy's 9th Division caught the Germans by surprise and thus ensured the rapid pace of the Collins Corps offensive. After occupying Cherbourg, the Germans recognized that the rapid change of direction of Eddy's division had deprived them of the respite they had anticipated in organizing the defense of that port city. Having directed the 7th Corps northwards to attack Cherbourg, Collins was forced to turn his back on the enemy at the base of the Cotentin Peninsula. To cover him from the rear, I positioned Middleton's 8th Corps along the base of the peninsula. These forces were not enough to hold a 29-kilometre front. The 82nd and 101st Divisions were badly under strength, and the 90th Division was morally depleted. However, as long as Middleton was behind the marshes stretching across the base of the Cotentin Peninsula, he had nothing to fear from an enemy advance. But this advantage was negated by the opportunity afforded to the enemy of strengthening his defences. The more time we gave him to establish a defensive line behind the marshes, the greater the difficulties we would have to encounter later in breaking through these positions. I preferred to be counterattacked now rather than give the enemy an opportunity to entrench. I therefore ordered Middleton to advance behind the marshes. But as he had no forces for a powerful offensive, he was to extend his front gradually and advance until Collins captured Cherbourg. As we walked with Troy through his command centre, having previously agreed on a plan of action, I took him by the shoulder and said, "By God, I shall be dreadfully glad when Joe takes Cherbourg and we can start against the main forces of the enemy. The enemy is running now, and we must give him no respite." On the morning of Collins' rush to Cherbourg, we awoke to the ominous whistling of the wind. The sky was enveloped in leaden clouds, and the cold, slanting rain was whipping the tent canvas. Kean, shifting his feet uneasily on the viscous ground, escorted me to the tented dining room in the middle of the orchard. He frowned, looking up at the sky from under his helmet. Yes, Collins had little chance of fighter air support today. 3 kilometres beyond our command post, the English Channel was covered in white crests of waves, and foam was boiling near the scrubby cliffs of Point du Haut. Weather forecasts spoke of an impending storm. However, it was not until Wilson's report of the cessation of unloading at the Omaha section that we realized what a serious crisis the storm had caused. On the eve of the 2nd day of the storm, the Rear Department reported that the Omaha section was awash with wrecked ships. The waves of the channel were throwing flat-bottomed vessels ashore in packs. On the 3rd day of the storm, the artificial harbour at the Omaha site was badly damaged. Huge reinforced concrete caissons, made in England and towed across the channel to build an artificial port for unloading ships in all weathers, were thrown ashore by the waves. The English designed and constructed 2 such huge structures, one for their landing site and one for ours. Fortunately, the artificial harbour at the Monty site withstood the storm, thus proving to be one of the most remarkable installations of the home front service during the war. On the 22nd of June, we arrived on the coast to ascertain the extent of the damage done. The picture that appeared before our eyes appalled me. The destruction was greater than on the first day of the invasion. Activity at the Omaha site had come to a standstill. Even the deminers who had been working on the coast hid in their damp dens, seeking protection from the wind and rain. 4 days of storm had posed a greater threat to Operation Overlord than all the enemy guns had done in the 14 days we had been on the coast. There were hundreds of mutilated vessels lying on the shingle, tossed about by the sea. At the very spot where we had landed at Easy Red, a broken metal ferry struck the side of another ferry with every new wave that came in. The bow of a sunken tank landing craft was visible on the shoal, the water churning inside the hull of the vessel. Another such vessel dangled helplessly in the sea on the waves, and the waves rolled over the abandoned vehicles on its bloated deck. A Navy lieutenant, wearing a jacket worn by soldiers in Rangers units, ran up to us. I smiled crookedly. It's hard to believe all this could have been done by one storm. The lieutenant glanced at my stars. General, he said, it would have been better if the whole damn German air fleet had swooped down on us. We were very sorry for the loss of ships and other military property, but what grieved us most of all was that the delivery of a vast amount of supplies had ceased. The deficit grew day by day, eventually reaching thousands of tonnes of undelivered supplies. Meanwhile, the Germans took advantage of the misfortune that had befallen us. While the Allied pilots were cursing the weather that had chained the fighters to the ground, they were dropping reinforcements along the roads. Even in the darkest hours of the storm, however, we thanked God that the storm had not broken a week earlier. During the fortnight we'd been ashore, we had accumulated supplies without which we could easily have been thrown into the sea. However, the loss of ammunition as a result of the storm forced us to tighten our belts. We had only 3 days' ammunition left in our stores, so we reduced the ammunition allowance for Collins, advancing on Cherbourg, and immediately restricted the objectives of Middleton, advancing at the base of the Khotin Peninsula. I visited Troyes just on the eve of the offensive. On my way back to Army headquarters, I was stopped by Keane, with whom was Colonel John Medaris. Medaris I took to me from the 2nd Corps and made him Chief of Artillery and Technical Service of the 1st Army. Medaris has something to tell you, Keane said. Ammunition stocks are so low that the Army could only supply Middleton's offensive by reducing Collins' ammunition allowance. You want me to call off Middleton's advance? Yes, sir. Do you know how important Middleton's advance is to us? Of course, sir, Medaris replied. Do you know that if we start the offensive now, we will save many lives later? Yes, sir. And yet you oppose it. I suggested, General, I don't think we'll be able to supply this offensive with ammunition. I've turned to Key. Tack Tubby Thorson and tell him the 8th Corps offensive is cancelled. I'll go back to Middleton and inform him of this. Then I'll go to Joe's. For a fortnight, Middleton waited for ammunition on his section of the front, while the enemy fortified on the south side of the marshes. When at last, in preparation for a breakthrough, we made our way across the base of the peninsula, it was clear to us how successfully the Germans had utilized that time. However, as much as we would have liked to prevent the enemy from reinforcing their positions, the lack of ammunition made it impossible to do so. However, we were constantly short of ammunition, which became particularly acute after the storm. We were in dire need of ammunition throughout the autumn and winter until the forcing of the Rhine. In planning our ammunition requirements, Medaris was quite free to make requisitions for ammunition, and Wilson was equally free to provide tonnage. In any landing on an enemy shore, however, the quantity of supplies coming in was limited chiefly by the ability of the engineer units to unload the ships. The crisis at the Omaha site on the first day of the invasion overturned Wilson's calculations from the start. We were unable to bring ashore a single ton of the 4,600 tons scheduled for unloading on the first day. By the end of the week, the deficit was already 35,000 tonnes. According to Admiral Ramsay, the ground forces lost 20,000 vehicles and 140,000 tons of supplies as a result of the storm. In the American landing zone alone, 83,000 soldiers were delayed in getting ashore during the days of the storm. We could have been in an even worse position if we had not unloaded ashore an inviolable reserve of ammunition, transporting them on a dozen large seaworthy barges. Some months before the invasion, I recommended to Leake that he take the precaution of transporting large quantities of ammunition across the channel on barges. There were no barges of 1,000 tons displacement in England, and he applied to Washington for such barges. General Brayon Samvel, chief of the supply services, soon sent us these barges, and we transported 12,000 tons of ammunition across the strait on them. Some years after the war, a shipowner in New York told me one evening that a couple of months before the invasion, the biggest barges had been taken from him. They had to be dragged across the Atlantic, he added with a smile. We figured some bright youngster on Eisenhower's staff had pranked Washington with that wild idea. Did he? Yes, sir, I said, embarrassed. You're right. The responsibility for the shortage of ammunition in the first month after the landing lay with the Fleet and Army Service Commands stationed in England. In spite of their excellent achievements during the invasion, both commands had failed in a number of important measures which might have made the landings much more efficient. The complex system of supply organization in unloading supplies on an unequipped coast, especially when thousands of tons are unloaded daily, must work extremely coherently to meet the needs of the troops for all supplies. To determine the order of unloading transports, we asked Lieutenant General J. Lee, Chief of Supply Services, to send us, in advance of the arrival of the ship's cargo manifests by aeroplane. With these declarations, we could regulate the order of unloading of cargoes, and thus avoid unnecessary stockpiling of surplus supplies at the expense of urgent shortages. However, we did not receive the declarations and were therefore forced to unload all ships in succession, regardless of the importance of the cargoes delivered. Soon the coast was cluttered with thousands of tons of unnecessary supplies, while we were in dire need of some particularly important ones, such as artillery ammunition. We made several representations to the supply services on this subject. They gave us assurances, but we never received any declarations from them. The situation became unbearable, and I complained directly to Ike. The matter must be settled in 2 days, he replied, or the culprit would be dismissed. Thereafter we began to receive declarations of the ship's cargo without further apology or explanation. To finally remove the supply difficulties, however, we had to deal also with the United States Fleet Command. If the ship's cargo manifest helped us in unloading the ships, it was equally important to ascertain which ship had arrived at the raid. It appeared that not only did the Naval Command not have accurate information about the ships in the convoys, but as soon as the ships anchored they lost all communication with them. Perhaps the Navy never fully realized how difficult the problem was. At least it remained so until the end of June, when Kirk appointed Rear Admiral John Wilkes, who had come from England, as Chief of Naval Installations in France. Equally unpalatable was the Navy's refusal to unload tanked landing craft directly on the coast. Although these ships were flat-bottomed, which allowed them to moor directly to the shore, the Fleet Command objected to the approach of ships to the water's edge, fearing enemy artillery. They preferred to anchor the tank landing ships in the roadstead and transport cargo from them to shore on self-propelled ferries. As soon as the coast ceased to be shelled by the enemy, we insistently demanded from the Navy to withdraw its objections, to bring the tank landing ships directly to the shore and thereby halve the time of their unloading. Our suggestion, however, was passed by the ears. If, in the opinion of some captains, it was possible to lose tanks, the ships should not be subjected to such a fate. Only when the enemy was pushed back from the shore, the captains were ordered to bring their tank landing ships directly to the shore. Ammunition rationing began as soon as Jarrow reached the line in which he was to entrench himself while Collins advanced northwards on Cherbourg. At first Jarrow was limited to 25 shells per gun per day. He was allowed to save shells to enable him to fire harder if necessary. When the enemy counterattacked, the shell limit was lifted and he was allowed to fire without regard to the ammunition rate. However, when the 19th Corps came to the front line, Corps Commander Pet Corlett objected to the meagre rate for his artillery. Pet, I exhorted him. I hate this rationing system as much as you do. However, we must remember that we have no alternative. Either we ration now or we shoot all the shells, curl up and go home. Ammunition rationing was not only during the fighting on the bridgehead. Our artillery suffered from a shortage of shells until we reached the Roer. Although we experienced ammunition shortages at 4 different stages of the war in Europe, with each stage having different reasons for the shortages, the result was the same. We never had the right amount of ammunition. Franklin Delano Roosevelt's sons are also in the army, but they walk the streets of London in clean uniforms and regalia. They are from the Street of the Rich. On 24 June, Ike crossed the Channel to review our plans to use the 7th Corps in a new direction after the capture of Cherbourg. Having captured that port, Collins was to move south and join Middleton at the base of the Cotentin Peninsula. We were then to advance southwards across the marshes and take up a front on a line from the coast of the department of Calvados to Avranches. I had long ago abandoned the plan to break through Stilo to reach the sea at Coutances. The enemy here is too strongly fortified, and I did not want to waste my forces against the strongest point in his defence. In order to inflict much greater losses on the Germans, we concentrated our troops only against those installations where the enemy's strength could be most effectively undermined. Only after Eisenhower's visit to the coast at the end of June, we learned how dangerous and destructive was the bombing of England bombing aircraft shells FAU-1. The Germans began to use dive bombing planes against England from 15 June. However, most of the launching sites from which the FAU-1s were launched against London were located at a great distance from the position of our troops, and therefore we could not follow them. As a result, we carelessly dropped the account of the aeroplane launchers. This is just another German weapon, we assured each other, invented too late to save Hitler. When Eisenhower arrived at our place, I teased his adjutant, Lieutenant Colonel Ernest Lee of Indianapolis. "Why did you come here?" I asked. "To get a good night's sleep on our beachhead after London." However, there was more truth than humour in my joke. Although aeroplane shells never posed a threat to England like the Blitz in 1940, the Londoners soon realised that the new weapon lurked far more danger than had been anticipated. In July, Churchill reported that 2752 Englishmen had been killed in the first 3 weeks of bombing by aeroplane shells. The severely wounded numbered 3 times as many. However, the dreaded new gun came too late to affect the outcome of the war. Even before the invasion, intelligence indicated that the enemy did not have the ability to establish the production of aeroplane shells in sufficient numbers to make their effects felt. For almost the entire 18 days of our stay on the coast, Eisenhower impatiently paced the spacious rooms of the luxurious prison for generals, known to the world as the residence of the supreme headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force. Fed up with dealing with top-level strategy, statistical calculations, reports from logistics officers and tacticians, Ike was eager to slip out of the refined atmosphere of the supreme headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force in England and see the real state of affairs of the troops at the front. Some have argued that the best strategist is the kind of commander who is at a considerable distance from his troops. When formations and units exist for him as conventional signs on a map, the strategist works as if in a vacuum, and no extraneous motives are reflected in his decisions. If it were possible to wage war by simply pressing buttons, then it would not be difficult to develop a whole science of troop management. But war is as much a clash of passions as a clash of forces, so no commander can become a strategist unless he first studies his soldiers. The manifestation of human feelings does not hinder the management of troops at all. On the contrary, it makes it easier to lead. But if a commander does not value the lives of his soldiers and does not pay attention to their hardships, then he is not fit for command. In this case, he will not be able to determine the casualties that it will cost him to capture an object. By sacrificing men's lives deliberately, and sometimes even cruelly, the commander must steel his will, knowing that if he wastes fewer men now, he may waste more in the future. If the commander begins to worry excessively about the size of losses, he runs the risk of losing strategic perspective. When strategic perspective is lost, the war drags on and its cost in human lives increases immeasurably. Eisenhower believed, as we do, that the source of modesty is communication with the troops. No matter how difficult the duties of a commander, he cannot look into the eyes of the soldiers going to their death at his command without realizing how much easier his task is in comparison to the task received by the soldiers. Throughout the war in Europe, Eisenhower often traveled from the supreme headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force to the front and spoke to the soldiers. There, Ike, like us, saw the war as it really was, with its ruthless destruction of cultural assets. On the home front, war can sometimes look like an adventure. At the front, the picture is different. Together with Ike, we traveled to the sector of the 79th Division that occupied the center of Collins' front. There we took the division commander with us and drove up to the regiment standing at rest. In front of a water-filled helmet, which served as a mirror, a captain in an undershirt was soaping his cheeks in preparation for a shave. He glanced at us with annoyance as we shaded the light. First his eyes bulged. Then a look of despair appeared in them as he shifted his gaze from Ike's broadly smiling face to the division commander's face, distorted by a grimace. The captain stumbled to his feet and, with a towel around his neck, saluted and reported to the Supreme Commander. Eisenhower quickly walked around the soldiers, with the captain following behind him. Keeping his hands on his hips, with his chin held high, Eisenhower frowned slightly as he spoke curtly to the soldiers. Soldier, he addressed one of them. How many excellent riflemen are there in your squad? The BT, sir, I think. You reckon? A soldier ought to know, damn it. Know exactly what you got. He walked over to another one further back in the line. How many good marksmen do you have? No. 4. I'm one of them, sir. That's good. That's wonderful. Where are you from? Kentucky, sir. You have a good branch. Best in the company, sir. Do the men in the company think so? You see, sir? They're fools, aren't they? Ike laughed. The soldier smiled. We got into the jeep. His new summer uniform and depot cap. Eisenhower stood out among the troops, filling the roads in sweat-soaked uniforms and heavy helmets. Soldiers cheerfully greeted us, some of the bolder ones shouting from their cars. Hello, Ike. Eisenhower, sitting in the front seat of the jeep, turned to me. Though I do not want to go back, he said. I will be terribly happy when we will be with you. On the 5th day of the attack on Cherbourg, Collins broke through the outer rim of the defences, but the road to the port was closed by a chain of strongholds, in which the enemy had lodged. Against us were thrown divisions of anti-aircraft guns firing at ground targets. General von Schlieben's troops, entrenched in the citadel of Fort du Roule, from which the harbour was visible, were shelling us from above. The citadel was on an escarpment rising steeply behind Cherbourg. The guns of the enemy's coastal defence, located on the escarpment, kept under fire not only the approaches to Cherbourg from the sea, but also the streets of the town itself. We could not get round the fort without risking the fire of the heavy guns. I did not want to lose time in laying siege when we should have already advanced on Middleton's front at the base of the peninsula. So I asked Kirk to bombard the guns of the fort's coastal defences from the sea. If Kirk had suggested that I had given it a little thought, he would have been quite right, for the guns at Cherbourg had greater range and were considerably more numerous than those on our largest ships. Kirk, knowing that he might suffer serious losses, asked, "Is that imperative?" "Yes," I replied. "We must take Cherbourg as soon as possible." Kirk agreed without objection, despite the risk involved, and immediately ordered the 3 battleships to sail for action against the harbour fortifications. Once within range of the fortress guns, the battleships came under fire and were soon forced to withdraw in an unequal duel with the batteries of the coast defences. Kirk's willingness to help us, however, despite the risk of losing his ships, made me regret the earlier fury with which we had criticised the fleet for the slow unloading of our ships off the Normandy coast. Fortunately, Kirk's valiant gesture did not result in disaster and the fleet withdrew, suffering little loss. Meanwhile, the infantry had marched up the cliffs to Fort du Roule and undermined its fortifications. On the evening of 26 June, that is, on the 21st day after the invasion, Manton Eddy reported to me by telephone that von Schlieben, along with 800 soldiers taken prisoner in the underground fortress. However, fighting was still going on in parts of Cherbourg. In spite of the desperate situation, the garrison carried out von Schlieben's orders with a great fortitude which we had not expected from them. Manton reported that he was sending von Schlieben to army headquarters for interrogation. Could he not be compelled to give him a preliminary order for the cessation of resistance at Cherbourg? I asked. Have you already tried that? Does he refuse? Good, then send him. We'll send him straight to Monty. Major General Everett Hughes, the representative of the Supreme Headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force at my headquarters, was in the car with me when I talked to Eddy. We caught a big bird in Cherbourg, I explained, but he won't give the order for his troops to surrender. Hughes frowned. Are you going to invite him to dinner? I looked at him carefully. Do you think we should invite him? I asked. Hell, of course not, Hughes exclaimed. Hey, if the bastard had capitulated 4 days ago, I said, I might have invited him. But we've lost a lot of lives since then. I hope they feed him soldier food and send him to England on an infantry landing craft across the stormy English Channel. Von Schlieben later complained about the unworthy of civilized men treatment of a captured general of such high rank. He looked coldly at the breakfast prepared for him from the soldiers' rations, and expressed strong resentment to the chief of intelligence for the fact that there was no shower in the village house where he was placed. To somehow brighten his captivity and preserve the memory of better days, he brought with him the menu of a dinner held in his honour at Cherbourg less than a month before. There was lobster and Dutch cheese, goose liver pate, baked bluefish, roast leg of lamb, peaches and ice cream, fine wines, vintage champagne and Napoleon-era brandy. Dixon snorted loudly, reading the menu. And now he's going to England. Just at the height of the Brussels sprout season. Von Schlieben, however, underwent new humiliations while in our hands. A car carrying the general's suitcase on its way from Cherbourg collided with a lorry on its way to the army command post. The general's uniforms were scattered on the road, and before the military police arrived, the soldiers, greedy for souvenirs, stripped them of their stripes and insignia. In an effort to put the harbour out of commission, the Germans destroyed all harbour facilities at Cherbourg. Wharves, harbour cranes, depots, bridges, power generators and transformers were blown up and burnt. The harbour itself was flooded and thoroughly mined. However, engineering and reconstruction units entered the port on the heels of the infantry, and after 21 days the first Allied ships anchored in the harbour. By November, Cherbourg was passing 15,000 tons of cargo a day. In November alone, 433,000 tons of cargo were unloaded at Cherbourg, when the prisoners from Cherbourg filled our hastily expanded camps. The total number taken in the plan in the first 3 weeks after the invasion reached 38,000. The young officers maintained their arrogance, but the soldiers were stunned and downcast. Our airstrikes made them more worried.